The day Elsie Callahan rode into Dusty Creek with nothing but a saddle-worn mare, a borrowed pistol, and 3 weeks left before the bank swallowed her farm whole, every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared. It was the autumn of 1882, and the town of Dusty Creek, Texas, sat fat and sun-baked at the edge of the Llano Estacado, the kind of place where fortunes were made and ruined with equal indifference, where the wind carried red dust into everything you owned, and where the local banker, a man named Harold Prout, had made himself very comfortable collecting the farms of dead men's widows. Elsie Callahan was 27 years old, with copper-colored hair that had not been properly pinned since she left the Callahan homestead before dawn, and eyes the dark green of creek water after a summer rain. She was not a woman who trafficked in self-pity. She had buried her husband Thomas 8 months ago when a rattlesnake spooked his horse on the south pasture, and she had spent every day since trying to outrun the debt he had quietly accumulated with Harold Prout's bank. She had sold the cattle. She had sold the furniture her mother had brought over from Kentucky. She had sold Thomas's good rifle. None of it was enough. The Dusty Creek annual harvest race was a flat-out, 3-mile gallop across open country with a prize purse of $300, which was exactly the amount that stood between Elsie Callahan and losing the farm her father-in-law had broken his back building for 30 years. The race was in 18 days. She had heard about it from a farmhand named Gill who worked the property east of hers, and the moment she heard the number 300, she had felt something shift inside her chest, some stubborn valve that refused to close. She had a horse, not a good one, not by any reasonable measure. Rosie was a red roan mare of uncertain breeding, 12 years old, with a long back and a tendency to veer slightly left when she was tired. But Rosie was Elsie's, and Rosie was all she had. She tied Rosie to the post outside the general store and walked inside to ask about registering for the race. Walter Briggs, who ran the store and also unofficially served as the keeper of all local knowledge, looked at her from over his spectacles with an expression that tried very hard to be polite. "The harvest race," he said. "Yes," Elsie said, "the one with the $300 purse." "Mrs. Callahan," Walter said carefully, "that race has always been for the men of the county." "Is there a rule written down somewhere that says that?" she asked. Walter opened his mouth and then closed it. He shuffled through some papers beside the register. He unfolded a broadside that had been printed by the race committee back in 1878. He read it twice. His eyebrows climbed his forehead. "I cannot find one," he admitted. "Then I would like to enter," Elsie said. She placed the $2 registration fee on the counter, coins she had been carrying in her apron pocket for the past 4 days because she had not allowed herself to spend them on anything else. Walter looked at the coins. He looked at Elsie. He wrote her name in the ledger, his handwriting a little uneven, as if his hand was uncertain whether to complete the act. By nightfall, all of Dusty Creek knew that Elsie Callahan had entered the harvest race. By the following morning, there were opinions. She heard them in fragments as she walked to the livery stable to ask about the possibility of training on the track behind the fairgrounds. Men on the porch of the saloon saying it was a shame, what desperation did to a person. Women at the dry goods store exchanging looks that carried a particular kind of pity, the sort that assumed failure in advance. Hector Dunn, who owned the largest ranch in the county and whose son Marcus had won the last 2 races, laughed loud enough that Elsie heard it through the wall of the hardware store. She kept her face still and her chin level, and she did not allow any of it to touch her until she was back in her room at the boarding house she had taken for the week of preparation, where she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed slowly until the tightness in her throat passed. She was not going to lose this farm. She had promised Thomas on the night he died, with his hand going cool in hers and the cicadas screaming outside, that she would not let it go. She understood it was a promise made to a man who was leaving and could not hold her to it, but she held herself to it. That was the kind of woman Elsie Callahan was. The training track behind the fairgrounds was a rough oval cut into red dirt, bordered on one side by a split-rail fence and on the other by a stand of post-oak trees going yellow in the October air. Elsie arrived at first light, when no one else was about, and began working with Rosie in long, steady circles, getting the mare used to the feel of being pushed at a pace beyond her usual comfortable trot. On the third morning, she became aware that someone was watching her. He was leaning against the far fence with his arms crossed and his hat pulled low against the angle of the morning sun. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet stillness about him that suggested a man who was comfortable in his own skin without needing to announce it. He wore a dark canvas duster and boots that had seen considerable country. He was not one of the local men she recognized. Elsie brought Rosie around the near end of the track and deliberately did not look at him again. She did not need an audience. She needed to work. But when she finished the second circuit and slowed Rosie to a walk to cool her down, the man unfolded himself from the fence and walked along the outside of the rail in a way that brought him parallel to her without being intrusive. "That mare pulls left on the back stretch," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with a West Texas accent that had been smoothed down somewhat by travel. "You are compensating with your right rein. If you keep doing that, she will start anticipating and cutting the corner entirely by race day." Elsie looked at him. He had not taken his hat off, which might have been rude from someone who did not know better, but something about him suggested he knew better and simply had his hat at an angle that kept the sun out of his eyes rather than as a social statement. "I did not ask for your assessment," she said. "No," he agreed. "You did not. My name is Clement Yates. I just came in from Abilene and I have been watching horses run for longer than is probably healthy." "Clement Yates," she said, testing the name without meaning to. "Do you make a habit of leaning on other people's fences before the sun is properly up?" "Only when I see something worth watching," he said. And then, without elaboration or any particular expression of flattery, he pushed off the fence and walked away toward town, his hands in his duster pockets. Elsie stared after him for a moment. Then she looked at Rosie. "Do not say anything," she told the horse. Rosie flicked one ear. Clement Yates took a room at the Dusty Creek boarding house, the same one where Elsie was staying, which she discovered that evening at supper when he sat down at the other end of the shared table with a plate of beans and cornbread, and proceeded to have a quiet conversation with old Mr. Haskell about the weather patterns on the southern plains. He did not speak to her directly. He did not ignore her either. He existed in the room with the particular self-contained quality of a man who was comfortable being wherever he happened to be. She found herself listening to the conversation he was having even though she was ostensibly focused on her own meal and on the small notebook where she had been calculating feeding schedules and distances for Rosie's training. He was knowledgeable. More than that, he was precise. When Mr. Haskell said something imprecise about the distance between Abilene and Amarillo, Clement corrected it without condescension, simply offered the accurate figure and moved on. After supper, she went to check on Rosie at the livery stable and found that someone had left a fresh bale of better quality hay than she had been able to afford, placed neatly in the stall without any note or explanation. She asked the stable boy about it, and he said a man had paid for it that afternoon, and he described Clement Yates. She stood in the stable doorway for a long moment with her arms crossed. The next morning she was at the track before dawn. He was already there. He was on the far side of the fence again, but this time he had a small notebook in his hand and he was writing in it. She brought Rosie to the fence and looked at him directly. "What are you writing?" she asked. He held the notebook up. It was full of small, neat figures and diagrams. "Stride length calculations," he said. "Rosie takes longer strides than the horses she will be racing against. Her weakness is speed off the start. Her advantage is endurance. If the race is 3 miles, she should be held back for the first mile, allowed to settle into her stride in the second, and then pushed in the final mile when the others are tiring." Elsie stared at him. "How do you know about the other horses?" "I have been watching them train," he said. "Marcus Dunn's horse is a gray quarter horse named Phantom. Quarter horses are explosive at short distances, but they flag over 3 miles. There is a bay gelding entered by a rancher named Coot Ellers, and he is quick off the start, but he has a hitch in his left hind that gets worse when the ground is soft. If it rains before race day, his pace will drop significantly in the back half." "You have been studying the competition," Elsie said slowly. "I have," he said. "For whose benefit?" He looked at her for a moment with something steady and uncomplicated in his expression. "For yours," he said, "if that is acceptable to you." She ought to have told him she did not need his help. She almost did. But she thought about the $300 purse and the 18 days remaining in Harold Prute's office with its heavy walnut desk, and the deed to the Callahan farm in the second drawer on the left, and she said instead, "Tell me about the strategy again. From the beginning." His name was Clement Yates, and he was 32 years old, and he had come to Dusty Creek, Texas from Abilene, where he had spent the past 3 years working as a horse trainer and occasional race consultant for a string of quarter horses owned by a man named Beaumont. He had not planned to stay in Dusty Creek more than 2 days. He had been heading southwest toward a job on a ranch outside El Paso, and had stopped because his own horse threw a shoe and the blacksmith needed until Friday to fit a proper one. That was how he had ended up at the boarding house. And that was how, on his second morning in town, while drinking coffee on the porch in the pre-dawn quiet, he had heard hoofbeats on the track behind the fairgrounds and walked down to investigate, and seen a red roan mare carrying a woman with copper hair loose around her shoulders running circles in the early mist like she was trying to outrace something that could not be outrun. He had watched for 40 minutes before he spoke. He had not intended to speak at all, but the thing with the left-pulling rein bothered him the way a wrong note bothered a musician, and before he had fully decided to open his mouth the words had come out. He had walked away afterward and told himself that was the end of it. He had a job in El Paso. He had his own plans, such as they were, and they did not include a widow's horse race in a small town in the Llano Estacado. But he went back to the track the next morning. He did not examine his own motivations too closely. He was a man who dealt in practical things. He had seen a horse being trained inefficiently for a race, and he had information that could make that training more efficient. That was all. That was a perfectly sufficient explanation for why he was standing at the fence at 5 in the morning when he could have been sleeping. He was reasonably intelligent. He knew that was not all. Elsie Callahan had a quality that was very difficult to describe and that he had not previously encountered in quite that particular form. It was not simply that she was beautiful, though she was. It was not simply that she was determined, though she was that too, fiercely so. It was something in the combination of those two things, with a third quality that he was having trouble naming. She moved through the world as if she had decided to take it seriously, as if everything she did was worth doing properly, and that quality lived in the set of her shoulders and the angle of her chin, and the way she looked at Rosie when she was working the mare, with this focused tenderness that was nothing like sentiment and everything like love. He bought the hay because it was the practical thing to do. Rosie needed better feed if she was going to train at this intensity. He did not think about it beyond that. He told himself that as well. The days that followed settled into a pattern. Elsie trained in the early mornings and Clement was there, first outside the fence and then, after she told him with characteristic directness that if he was going to offer advice he might as well come inside and make himself useful, on the track with her. He had a way of giving instruction that did not condescend. He watched and he thought, and when he spoke it was to the point, and Elsie was a fast learner who took his observations and applied them immediately and did not argue unless she had a reason to. She had reasons to argue sometimes, which he found he enjoyed more than he probably should have. "You are holding her too tight in the turn," he said on the 5th morning. "You need to trust her balance." "I know her balance," Elsie said. "She drifts when she is loose in the turn, She drifts because she does not trust herself. She is following your lead. If you trust her, she will trust herself. That sounds like philosophy rather than horse training. In my experience, he said, they are the same thing. She looked at him for a long moment from the back of the roan mare, with the early light coming sideways across the track and turning her hair the color of firelight. And then she loosened the rein slightly, and Rosie ran the turn clean. Elsie said nothing when she came back around. But there was a small change in her expression that was not quite a smile and was not quite the absence of one, and that expression stayed with Clement for the rest of the day in a way that was not entirely comfortable. They began talking in the evenings. Not because either of them arranged it, but because after supper at the boarding house it became natural for them to take their coffee out to the porch and watch the sun go down behind the mesa in the west. And conversation was the natural result of two people sitting in proximity with time on their hands. He learned that Elsie had grown up in Kansas, that her father had been a school teacher who believed women deserved exactly the same education as men, and that she had married Thomas Callahan when she was 22 and come to Texas with him and helped build the farm from nothing. She talked about Thomas with a care that he recognized as the specific tenderness of grief that has been lived with long enough to reach some kind of peace. She did not talk about him to make Clement uncomfortable. She talked about him because Thomas had been real and important, and erasing him from conversation felt dishonest. Clement told her about Abilene and about the 3 years working with Beaumont's horses, and about the fact that he had grown up in New Mexico territory on a ranch that his father had run until drought and bad luck, and a string of poor decisions had reduced it to nothing. He had been 21 when the ranch went under. He had spent the years since moving from job to job, never quite rooting anywhere, which was something he had come to accept about himself without particularly liking it. "Do you miss having somewhere to stay?" Elsie asked one evening. The question was direct in the way her questions always were, as if she had decided that language was a tool and should be used precisely. "I miss having something that's mine," he said, which was more honest than he had intended to be, and he looked at his coffee cup for a moment afterward as if he was surprised to find the words had come out. "Yes," Elsie said quietly. "I understand that." The race was 13 days away when Harold Prout came to find Elsie at the training track. He was a pink-faced man in his 50s with a good suit and a smile that had been calibrated to suggest generosity while performing the opposite function entirely. He came in a buggy and stayed on the far side of the fence and spoke to Elsie from the high seat as if the difference in elevation was meaningful. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, "I have been hearing about your endeavors. Very spirited, very admirable." "Mr. Prout," Elsie said. She had stopped Rosie at the fence and was sitting very straight on the mare's back. "I wanted to make you an offer," he said. "I understand the circumstances of your situation. A young widow, a struggling property. My bank is in the business of solutions, not problems. I would be willing to extend the loan on the Callahan farm by 60 days in exchange for a small additional arrangement." "What arrangement?" Elsie said. "The east pasture," Prout said. "Just that parcel. Sign it over and the loan clock stops for 60 days. Gives you time to find your footing." The east pasture was where the creek ran. It was the only reliable water source on the property. Without it, the rest of the farm was not farmable. Harold Prout knew that perfectly well. "I appreciate your offer," Elsie said, with a voice as flat and even as the plains behind her. "I will be winning that race in 13 days and paying off the loan in full. Good morning." Prout's smile stayed in place, but something behind it went cold. "Mrs. Callahan, the other entrants are men who have been racing horses their entire lives. I would not want to see you embarrassed." "Good morning, Mr. Prout," she said again. He drove away. Clement, who had been standing back from the fence during this exchange, said nothing for a moment after the buggy was gone. Then he said, "East pasture is the water rights." "Yes," Elsie said. She was looking at the direction Prout had gone and her jaw was set. "He would have made that offer regardless of the race," Clement said. "Even if you had never entered, he would have found a way to that pasture." "Yes," she said again, "I know that. He is not going to stop at one offer. I know that too." She looked at him then, and what was in her eyes was not fear. It was something harder than fear, something that had been through fear and come out the other side and was operating on a purely determined frequency. He felt it like a physical thing. "Then we should make the most of 13 days, he said. She nodded. She turned Rosie back toward the track. The days were long and the work was genuine. Clement adjusted Rosie's training based on the information he was gathering from watching the other entrants. He was meticulous about it. He kept notes on Marcus Dunn's Phantom, who was a beautiful animal and would be fast, but who Marcus rode with a heavy hand that tired the horse unnecessarily in the early stretches. He kept notes on Coot Eller's Bay Gelding, whose hitch in the left hind was exactly as he had predicted, a slight muscle tension that would worsen with exertion. He noted a third strong contender, a lean buckskin owned by a rancher named Sid Graves who lived up near the Caprock, a horse called Creek that was young and possibly the fastest thing in the county over a short distance, but whose young legs might not have the conditioning for a full 3 miles at race pace. He shared all of this with Elsie every morning. She listened with the same concentrated attention she applied to everything, asked sharp questions, and incorporated what she learned into the way she rode. She was good. He had known that from the first morning, but she was getting better, and it was the particular kind of better that comes from a rider and a horse learning to trust each other at a new level. He watched Rosie begin to move differently under her, more freely, the leftward drift gradually correcting as the mare responded to the subtle changes Elsie was making in how she distributed her weight through the turns. There was something almost aching about watching it. Not sad, just large. On the 9th day before the race, it rained. A steady soaking October rain that turned the training track to mud and kept them inside. Elsie spent the morning in the stable with Rosie, brushing the mare down and checking her legs with careful hands while Clement sat on a hay bale and read aloud from the small newspaper he had picked up, partly because the silence felt like it needed something in it and partly because it gave him an excuse to be there. He was in the middle of reading a piece about the cattle market when Elsie said, without looking up from Rosie's near foreleg, "Why are you still here?" He paused. "I beg your pardon." "Your horse's shoe has been fixed for 5 days, she said. She was still not looking at him. Her hands were moving slowly over the mare's cannon bone, checking for any heat or swelling. "The job in El Paso is still waiting. You could have left." He considered the newspaper in his hands for a moment. Outside the stable door the rain came down in steady gray curtains. "I could have," he agreed. She looked up at him then and her expression was a question. He said, "The race is 9 days away. I'm not going to leave before I know how it turns out." "And after?" she asked. It was a quiet question, not pointed, just honest. He did not answer immediately, which was the most honest answer he had. He looked at her across the warm, hay-smelling stable with the rain on the roof making a sound like something being gently insisted upon, and he felt the full weight of the question in a way that had nothing to do with horses or races. "I do not know," he said finally. "I am trying to figure that out." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to checking Rosie's legs, and he went back to the newspaper, but the quality of the silence between them had changed into something that was not the absence of conversation, but the presence of something else entirely. That evening after supper, when the rain had slowed to a thin drizzle and the street outside the boarding house windows was dark and reflective, Elsie came downstairs from her room carrying a photograph. She set it on the table in front of Clement without preamble. "That is Thomas," she said, "and that is the farm." It was a stiff albumin print, slightly faded, showing a broad-shouldered man with a wide smile standing in front of a farmhouse with a woman who was unmistakably Elsie, younger, with her hair properly pinned, her hand on the man's arm. Behind them, the farmhouse was modest but well-built, with a kitchen garden along the south wall and a good-looking barn behind it. Clement looked at the photograph carefully. Thomas Callahan had an open face and the particular look of a man who expected the world to deal fairly with him, which was the look of either an optimist or a man who had not yet been tested. Looking at him, Clement could not tell which. He was a good man, Elsie said. She sat down across from Clement at the table. He was not practical about money. That was not out of meanness, it was out of optimism. He always believed the next year would be better, and then there were no more next years. "I am sorry," Clement said. "Thank you." She looked at the photograph. "I am not showing you this to make you feel sorry for me. I am showing you because I think you have been wondering about it and I would rather you know than wonder." He looked at her. The lamp on the table between them cast warm light across her face, and she looked directly back at him without any of the evasiveness or deflection he might have expected. "I loved him," she said, "and I am glad I did. And he has been gone 8 months and the world is still going." She paused. "I am telling you this because I think you are a man who needs to know where he stands before he can stand anywhere." He was quiet for a long moment. The rain dripped from the porch eave outside the window in a slow, uneven rhythm. "That is a perceptive thing to say," he said. "I am a perceptive woman," she said, with enough lightness in it that it was not arrogant, just accurate. He reached across the table and turned the photograph so he could see the farm behind the figures again. The kitchen garden, the solid barn, the particular solidity of a place that had been built by people who intended to stay. "I grew up on a place like that," he said, "before it was gone." "I know," she said. "You told me." "I think that is why I cannot stand the idea of this one being gone," he said, and he heard his own words with a slight surprise, because he had not known he was going to say that, and because the word this carried more than just the farm in it. Elsie heard that too. He could tell by the very slight change in her breathing and the way she looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she picked up the photograph and stood. "Get some sleep," she said. "We have 8 more days of training and I need you sharp." "Yes, ma'am," he said, which made her smile genuinely for the first time since he had met her. A full, uncomplicated smile that changed the whole arrangement of her face into something that hit him somewhere between his ribs and stayed there. The week before the race became its own kind of world. The town of Dusty Creek shifted into race preparation, with men arriving from surrounding ranches and farms for the annual event. The main street filling up with horses and riders and wagons, and the particular festive tension that precedes something competitive. The Dusty Creek Harvest Race was not a formal institution in the way of larger cities, but it was serious in the way of things that matter to the people involved, with a betting book kept by a man named Pete Simmons at the saloon, and a set of stakes that represented genuine money for genuine purposes. Elsie's entry had moved from a source of head-shaking pity to something that the town could not quite decide what to do with. Women at the dry goods store who had been pitying her began watching her ride through town on Rosie with expressions that mixed admiration and concern in roughly equal parts. The men were more complicated. Some of them had been on the receiving end of hard circumstances themselves and recognized the quality of what she was doing. Others, particularly those in Marcus Dunn's orbit, made jokes that carried an edge. Marcus Dunn himself was 23 years old and had won the last 2 races on the gray quarter-horse Phantom and knew it. He was not a bad young man in any deep sense. He was simply a young man who had been indulged by a wealthy father and had no particular reason yet to develop the character that adversity might have built. He rode Phantom past the training track one afternoon while Elsie was working and called out something about ladies belonging in the kitchen that got a laugh from the 2 riders with him. Clement was at the fence. He turned and looked at Marcus Dunn with a very quiet, very level expression that conveyed, without any words or drama, that this was not a conversation Marcus wanted to continue. Marcus was young, but he was not stupid enough to miss that look. He rode on. Elsie had not flinched. She had finished the circuit she was on and brought Rosie back to the fence. "You did not need to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She looked at him for a moment with that expression that was almost a smile. Clement, Elsie. They looked at each other, and the afternoon light was very clear, and the air smelled of October and horses, and something in the moment felt like standing at the edge of something the exact shape of which could not yet be seen. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You are welcome," he said. The night before the race, Elsie could not sleep. She lay in the narrow boarding-house bed and stared at the ceiling and ran through everything. The distance. Rosie's stride. The strategy. Hold back in the first mile, settle in the second, push in the third. Trust Rosie's endurance. Don't be startled by Phantom's explosive start. Let Coots Bay tire itself in the mud if the ground stayed damp. Watch for Creek, the young buckskin, because young horses surprised you. She had run it through so many times that the words had stopped having meaning and become just a rhythm. She got up before midnight and went down to the stable. The town was quiet around her, the main street empty and silver under a three-quarter moon. She let herself into Rosie's stall and sat on the clean straw beside the mare's legs and pressed her forehead against the warm solidity of Rosie's shoulder. "We have to do this," she told the horse. "I know you are 12 years old, and I know the other horses are faster off the start, but we know this. We have been working for this." Rosie stood perfectly still and breath slow and warm. "I will not let Prout have the creek pasture," she said. "I will not let him have any of it. Thomas spent 10 years on that ground, and his father spent 30, and I have spent 5. And none of us are going to let a man in a good suit take it in the name of compound interest." She sat there for a while. The barn was quiet and smelled of horses and dry hay, and the particular piece of a place where living things are resting. She heard the stable door open softly. She did not need to look to know who it was. Clement came and sat on the hay bale near the stall entrance without saying anything, which was one of the things she had learned to value about him, his understanding that some moments did not need to be filled. After a while she said, "I keep thinking about whether I am doing the right thing." "You are," he said. "How do you know?" "Because the alternative is letting Prout have the farm," he said, "and that is not the right thing. What if Rosie is not fast enough? What if I am not good enough?" "You are good enough," he said. "I have been watching horses run for 12 years, and I have trained some of the best quarter horses in West Texas, and I am telling you that what you and Rosie have done in the past 16 days is real. It is genuine. You are ready." She turned her head to look at him through the dim stable light. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees and his hat off for once, and he looked younger without it, his dark hair slightly disordered, his expression entirely unguarded. "Are you frightened for me?" she asked. He met her gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "I am." The directness of it moved her more than any careful reassurance could have. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm dark. "Clement," she said, "when the race is over, whatever happens, I need you to know that what you have done these past 16 days has meant more to me than I know how to say properly." "You can try," he said very quietly. She almost laughed. "It means that I came to this town alone and frightened, and I stopped being frightened," she said. "Not because the problem went away. Because someone was here." He stood up from the hay bale. He moved to the stall gate and stood close enough that she could see the small crease at the corner of his eye that appeared when he was thinking about something seriously. "Elsie," he said, "I need you to know something too. Tell me. When this race is over," he said carefully, "I would like to stay, if that is something you would want. If it is not, I will understand it and I will go, but I would like to stay." The words settled into the quiet of the stable with an almost physical weight. The moonlight came in silver through the high window above the stall. She stood up. She was very close to him, separated by the stall gate, and she looked at him directly in the way she always looked at things she was taking seriously. "Ask me again after the race," she said, "when we are both on the other side of it." "All right," he said. "But Clement—" She put her hand on the stall gate between them, very close to where his hand rested. "The answer is going to be yes." He looked at her hand and then at her face, and something in his expression opened in a way she had not seen before, something warm and serious and entirely undefended. "Get some sleep," he said. "You have a race to win." She went back to bed and slept like a stone. Race day was the third Saturday of October, 1882, and Dusty Creek was alive with it. People had come in from 40 miles around, families in wagons and riders on horseback, and the particular festive disorder of a genuine county event. The main street was crowded from first light, with children weaving between adult legs and women setting up food tables along the front of the general store and men congregating at Pete Simmons's betting table outside the saloon in numbers that had Pete looking somewhat overwhelmed by the volume of business. Clement went to Pete's table in the early morning. Pete Simmons was a small, quick man with an ink-stained ledger and the focused expression of someone performing arithmetic under pressure. He had been taking bets since the previous afternoon, and the board behind him showed the current odds. Phantom was the favorite at 3-2. Creek, the young buckskin, was second at 2-1. Coots Bay Gelding was at 3-1. Three other horses, solid but undistinguished local animals, were at 5-1 or longer. Elsie Callahan and the roan mare Rosie were listed at 15-1. Clement looked at this number for a long moment. He had $35 in his pocket, which was the sum total of what he had available to him in the world, the remainder of the wages from his last job in Abilene after paying for board and food and the farrier for his horse. He thought about the east pasture. He thought about Rosie's improved stride and Elsie's hands loose on the reins in the turn. He thought about Marcus Dunn's heavy hand tiring Phantom early in Coots Bay and its bad left hind on damp ground in Creek's young legs in the final mile. He put all $35 on Elsie Callahan. Pete Simmons looked at him. He looked at the $35. He wrote it in his ledger with the expression of a man who had seen stranger things and had learned not to comment. At 15-1, that pays out $525 if your horse wins, Pete said. I know, Clement said. That is a lot of money on a 15-1. I know, Clement said again. Pete looked at him with something that was almost respect and wrote the ticket. By 9 o'clock the race course was lined with people 3 deep on both sides. The course was a straight shot out to the Miller Creek landmark, then a wide turn back around the north end of the fairgrounds, and a final straight run to the finish line in front of the crowd. 3 miles total, across the hard-packed red clay and short grass of the Llano Estacado. The ground was still slightly damp from the week's rain, but the sun had been on it since dawn and it was drying fast. Clement walked the course before the riders assembled and checked the ground carefully, paying particular attention to the wet patches in the low sections. Coots Bay would suffer there. Phantom would do reasonably well. Rosie, with her longer stride and lighter touch, would handle it best of all. He went back to the start area to find Elsie. She was already mounted on Rosie, who stood with her ears forward and her nostrils slightly flared, reading the excitement in the air with the particular intelligence of a horse who knows something important is happening. Elsie had her hair braided and pinned, and she was wearing a practical riding jacket over her blouse, and she sat on Rosie with the straight ease of someone who had been in the saddle for 30 continuous days. She saw him coming through the crowd and something in her expression relaxed by a fraction. "How is the ground?" she asked. "The south section near the creek bed is still soft," he said. "Approximately halfway through the second mile. Stay left on the track there. The left side is higher and harder. Coots Bay will take the center and struggle." She nodded, absorbing it. "Phantom will go out fast," he said. "Let him, don't chase, don't let Marcus get into your head." "He is not in my head," she said. "Good, keep him out of it." There was a commotion to her left. Marcus Dunn rode Phantom up beside her, and the gray horse was indeed magnificent, dappled silver with a long neck and quick, elegant feet. Marcus himself was in a clean white shirt and looked every inch the 2-time champion. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, and his voice had lost the mocking quality from earlier in the week. He was almost formal. Perhaps his father had spoken to him. Or perhaps, faced with the actual moment, he found he had more decency in him than his earlier behavior had suggested. "Good luck today." Elsie looked at him. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "You ride well, ride your best." He looked slightly surprised, as if he had expected something sharper. He nodded and moved Phantom away. Clement looked up at Elsie. The starting official was calling the riders to the line. The crowd noise was building to a continuous roar. "Elsie," he said. She looked down at him from the mare's back. "Rosie has more left in her than anyone in this crowd believes," he said, "and so do you." Her hand came down briefly and touched his shoulder just once, a contact that lasted no longer than a second and meant more than a long speech. "I know," she said. The horses moved to the line. 9 animals in total, breathing hard and stamping, their riders sitting still or shifting nervously according to their natures. Elsie sat absolutely still. The starting pistol fired. Phantom went like a cannon shot. The gray horse was away in 3 strides and pulling clear almost immediately, which was exactly what Clement had predicted. Creek, the young buckskin, went with him, the two of them pulling away from the field in the first 100 yards in a way that pulled the crowd noise up to a roar. 3 other horses went after them hard. Coots Bay took a wide line and went fast in the center of the track. Rosie started 6th. This was the hardest part, and Clement knew it, watching from the rail. Watching Elsie hold Rosie back while the field went past her. Watching the horses pull away into the distance, trusting the strategy. He could see Elsie's hands steady on the reins, not fighting Rosie, just holding. The mare wanted to go, her stride wanting to open up, and Elsie was holding that energy like water in cupped hands, keeping it, not spending it. The field stretched out along the first mile, and the dust rose behind them in a long orange cloud that moved southwest, and then the horses went around the far landmark and came back around the north end of the fairgrounds, and Clement ran along the rail to get a better view of the second mile. Phantom was still leading, but Marcus's heavy hands were beginning to show. The gray horse's head was coming up slightly, which meant the neck was tightening, which meant fatigue was beginning to register. Creek, the buckskin, had dropped to 2nd but was running beautifully. 2 horses had already fallen back to a tired canter. Rosie was 5th and moving. Clement could see it in the mare's stride. The controlled energy from the first mile was beginning to release. Not explosively. Steadily, like water finding its level, the roan mare's long stride eating up ground in the measured way of a horse who had been trained properly over distance. Elsie's hands were riding with her now, not holding back, working with the stride. They passed the soft ground section near the creek bed. Coots Bay, which had been running strong in 4th, hit the soft center ground, and the hitch in its left hind became suddenly visible. A small stumble that broke the rhythm and took 3 strides to recover. And in those 3 strides, Rosie passed on the left on the harder ground and moved into 4th. The crowd noise from the finish area was continuous and overlapping. 3rd mile. Clement was running along the outside of the rail now, which was undignified, and he did not care. He could see the finish line a 1/4 mile ahead and the horses converging on it. Phantom had slowed perceptibly. Marcus was pushing hard, but the quarter horse's explosive energy was spent, and the 1.5 miles of hard running had done what distance always did to explosive horses. Creek was still running, but its young legs were coming up under it unevenly, the first signs of deep fatigue in an animal that had raced at the edge of its ability. Rosie was 3rd, then 2nd. Her stride was full and free, the long roan body fully extended now, and Elsie was riding with everything she had, low over the mare's neck, her face against the streaming mane. The crowd was making a sound unlike anything Clement had heard in a long time. It was not simply race noise. It was something else. Something that had been building for the past 16 days, or perhaps for longer, in all the private calculations of people who had watched Elsie Callahan and understood what she was attempting, and had not let themselves hope too hard. Creek faltered 50 yards from the finish, the young buckskin's legs finally giving out under the accumulated demand, dropping to a labored canter that took it out of contention in 4 strides. Rosie and Phantom ran the last 50 yards side by side. Marcus Dunn was using his crop. Elsie was not. She was talking to her horse, her mouth close to the roan mare's ear, and whatever she was saying was something Clement could not hear but could somehow feel across the length of the track. This particular human communication that a horse either understands or doesn't, and Rosie understood it. The roan mare's stride lengthened one final time, clean and full, and carrying everything Elsie had put into her over 16 days of early mornings and determination, and the quiet refusal to give up on something worth keeping. Rosie crossed the finish line by 2 lengths. The sound from the crowd was a single enormous thing, a unified noise of disbelief and joy, and something that took a moment to identify as pride. The communal pride of people who had witnessed something they had not fully believed possible until the moment it happened. Clement stopped running at the fence and held onto the top rail with both hands and felt his own breath come back to him in a long, unsteady exhale. Rosie came to a trot and then a walk, sides heaving, her breath coming in great warm clouds in the October air. Elsie sat on the mare's back and looked around at the crowd as if she was checking whether this was real. Several women near the finish line were crying. An old man next to Clement was repeating something quietly that Clement could not make out. A child had gotten through the fence somewhere and was standing in the middle of the track staring at the roan mare as if seeing something that would take years to fully understand. Elsie looked through the crowd and found Clement's face. He lifted one hand. He did not trust his voice. She nodded once, a single decisive nod, and something in her face gave way into an expression he had not seen before. Something that was not just relief or triumph, but the particular look of a person who has been carrying a weight so long they have forgotten what it was like not to carry it, and who has finally been able to set it down. The race committee presented the prize purse to considerable ceremony, and no small amount of visible discomfort on the part of certain committee members who had not anticipated this outcome, but were bound by their own rules. $300 in scrip and coin, presented by Forrest Kimball, the committee chairman, who had the grace to look at Elsie directly when he handed it over and say, "Well ridden, Mrs. Callahan." "Thank you, Mr. Kimball," she said. Clement collected his winnings from Pete Simmons, who paid out without comment, though his expression suggested he was revising his methodology for setting odds. $525 in his hand, which was more money than Clement Yates had owned at one time in his adult life. He went looking for Elsie. He found her in the center of a small crowd of women who had come forward after the race in the way that people come forward after a moment of genuine courage, drawn to be near it. She was gracious with them and patient, and he could see that she was also slightly overwhelmed and was holding herself together through the sheer force of the same will that had held her together through everything else. He waited until the crowd had thinned, standing a little distance away with his hat in his hands. When she turned and saw him, she came to him directly and without ceremony, and he opened his arms and she walked into them. And he held her the way you hold something you are simultaneously afraid of losing and finally sure of having, and she pressed her face against the front of his duster and breathed. They stayed like that for a long moment in the middle of the post-race crowd of Dusty Creek, Texas, with the October sun going west and the dust of 3 miles of racing still hanging golden in the air. "We need to go to the bank," she said into his chest, "before Prout closes for the day." "Yes," he agreed, "and then I am going to sleep for approximately 3 years." Laughed, the sound of it moving through his chest under her ear. "That seems fair." She pulled back and looked at him. Her face was flushed with the exertion of the race and her braid had come partly undone and she had never looked more like herself to him, more completely and particularly herself. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her. "Ask you what?" "You said you would ask me again," she said. "After the race." He understood. He took a breath that felt like it was coming from a considerable depth. "Elsie," he said, "I would like to stay." "Yes," she said. She had said the answer would be yes, and she had been right, but hearing herself say it aloud made it real in a different way, made it solid and present and forward-looking, and she felt it in her chest like something settling into place. "Yes." He took her hand. Not dramatically, not with any gesture larger than the gesture required. Just took her hand and held it, his thumb moving once across her knuckles with a kind of careful wonder, as if he was making sure of the weight of the thing he was holding. "Come on," she said. "Bank closes at 4. They walked down the main street of Dusty Creek together, hand in hand, with Rosie led behind them and the autumn light coming down long and golden between the buildings. And the people of Dusty Creek who saw them did not say much, but they noticed, and what they noticed was something that lived in the space between two people and was its own kind of visible. Harold Prout was at his desk when they came in. He looked at Elsie. He looked at Clement. He looked at the prize envelope in her hand. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. His smile was at half measure. "Mr. Prout," she said. She placed the prize money on his desk. "I would like to pay off the loan on the Callahan farm, in full, today." Prout looked at the money. He looked at her. He picked up the loan document from the second drawer on the left side of his desk, which was exactly where Elsie had imagined it, and he went through the calculation with the careful deliberateness of a man making sure there was no arithmetic to dispute, and there was not. He stamped the document paid. He handed it back to her. She held it. The loan document for the Callahan farm, stamped in red ink with the word satisfied and the date October 21st, 1882. Her father-in-law's 30 years. Thomas's 10, her 5. Clement put his hand on her back between her shoulder blades and she stood straight. "Thank you, Mr. Prout," she said. "Good day." Outside on the street she stood in the October afternoon with the document in her hands and felt the full specific weight of what had just happened. She had done it. She was done doing it. She had her farm. "Are you all right?" Clement asked. "Yes," she said. She looked at the document and then at the street and then at him. "I am very much all right." They went back to the boarding house. Elsie went upstairs to her room and sat on the bed and held the document and cried briefly and quietly. The kind of crying that has nothing to do with sadness but is the release of something that has been held too tightly for too long. And when it was done, she felt clean and light and very certain. She came downstairs and found Clement in the parlor with 2 cups of coffee and an expression that had been waiting to see how she was. "Thank you," she said, sitting across from him. "I mean that entirely and for all of it. You won the race," he said, "with 16 days of preparation that I could not have done without you." "You could have," he said. "It would have been harder, but you could have." "Maybe," she allowed. "But I am glad I didn't have to." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "Clement, when you said you wanted to stay, what does that look like for you? I need to understand what I am saying yes to." He looked at her steadily. "I want to be on the Callahan farm with you," he said. "I want to be useful to it and to you. I understand that I have been in your life for 16 days and that is not a long time, and I am not asking you to decide everything tonight. But I want you to know that I am not staying in order to leave later. I am not someone who is good at partial things." "No," she said. "I did not think you were." "The farm needs work," he said. "The south fence line is down in 2 places. You need a second horse for the spring plowing. The barn roof on the east side wants new boards." She looked at him with an expression that held a complicated warmth. "You have been to the farm?" "I rode out there 2 weeks ago," he said, "just to look, to understand what we were working toward." The word "we" was quiet in the sentence, but it was there and they both heard it and neither of them corrected it. "I see," she said. "I am practical," he said. "I cannot help it." "It is one of the things I like most about you," she said. The following morning they rode back to the Callahan farm together, Elsie on Rosie and Clement on his own horse, a sensible dun named Dutch that had been waiting patiently in the livery for the past 18 days. The farm was 14 miles from Dusty Creek, sitting in a shallow valley where a creek came down from the caprock, and the land was good, deep-red topsoil over limestone, with the kind of natural water that made things grow. Coming down the last ridge, Elsie stopped and looked at it from above. The farmhouse, white painted, somewhat in need of fresh paint, with the kitchen garden still holding the last of the fall vegetables. The barn, solid and large. The south pasture going brown and dry in October but rich in the memory of summer. The east pasture where the creek ran, bright in the morning light, the water catching the sun in pieces. "There it is," she said. "Yes," Clement said beside her. She breathed in the smell of it, dry grass and red dirt and creek water, and she felt herself settle back into it the way you settle into something you belong to. They went down the ridge together. The first weeks on the farm were full of the practical business of preparation for winter. Clement fixed the south fence line. He replaced the east side boards on the barn roof. Elsie replanted the kitchen garden with winter crops and began the work of sorting through what the farm needed for the coming year, making lists and calculations with the same precise attention she brought to everything. He slept in the barn, which was proper, and she slept in the farmhouse, which was also proper, and the distance between these two facts was an acknowledged thing that neither of them was in a hurry to resolve without the appropriate care. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, and talked through supper, and sat on the porch in the evenings with the vast dark sky of the Llano Estacado above them, and the coyotes going in the south pasture, and the creek running its quiet music in the east. And every evening Clement thought about kissing her, and every evening he found that the timing was not quite right, which was a remarkable thing for a man who had never previously been particularly troubled by timing. She was the one who resolved it. Because she was Elsie Callahan, and she was not patient with unnecessary delays. It was a Thursday evening in late October, 3 weeks after the race, and they were sitting on the porch steps in the clear, cold air, and she was explaining her plan for expanding the horse operation, using Rosie as a foundation mare and introducing a good stallion in the spring, and he was listening and adding observations. And at some point she stopped talking mid-sentence and turned and looked at him with the direct green gaze that he was so thoroughly familiar with by now. "Are you going to kiss me, Clement Yates?" she said. "Or are we going to sit on this porch until we are both very old and regret not doing it while we were young?" He looked at her for 1 second. He said, "That is a fair point." And he kissed her. It was gentle at first, careful and asking, and then she kissed him back with the same quality she brought to everything she did, fully and without reservation, and he put his hand against her jaw and felt her lean into it. And the October night was very cold and very clear, and neither of them noticed. When they stopped, she put her forehead against his, and they sat like that for a moment with their breath mingling in the cold air. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think that was worth the 3 weeks of waiting," she said. "It was," he agreed. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch steps of the Callahan farm, with the stars coming out in their thousands above the Texas plains, and did not say anything more, because nothing more needed to be said. The winter passed in the particular way of winters on the Llano Estacado, hard and beautiful and full of work. Clement turned out to be as useful as he had promised to be, which was very, because he understood land and horses and the 10,000 small practical demands of a working farm in a way that came from having grown up on one, and from 12 years of working various properties around the territory. He also understood when to offer advice and when to keep quiet, which was a rarer skill and one Elsie valued more than she could easily say. She taught him things too. She was a better keeper of records than he was, more precise with the ledger, and she had a knowledge of soil and planting that came from her Kansas upbringing and her years on the Callahan land that he genuinely lacked. They taught each other, which was the beginning of a particular kind of partnership, the kind built not on complementary weakness but on complementary strength. In December, on a cold, clear night when the blue norther had pushed the temperature down below freezing and the stars were very sharp and very close, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it with grand ceremony. He did not have a ring, which was a practical limitation he acknowledged, and said he would remedy as soon as it was possible. He did it on the porch again, which had become their particular place, bundled in coats and watching the frozen stars. "Elsie," he said, "I have been thinking about something." "You are frequently thinking about something," she said. "This is a specific thing." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars in that way he had of looking at things he was approaching carefully. "I would like to marry you," he said. "I know it has not been a long time. I know there are people who would say it is too soon. And I want you to know that I understand if you need more time and I will wait as long as you need. But I want to ask." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold starlight. "Clement," she said. "Elsie. I came to this farm when I was 22, and I have been on it for 5 years, and it is mine in a way that nothing else has ever been mine," she said. "And you are the first person since Thomas who has felt like a reason to stay somewhere. The first person who felt like a home." He was very still. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He breathed out slowly, and the breath was visible in the cold air, and then he reached over and took her hand in both of his and held it between them like something he intended to keep. They married in February of 1883 at the little Methodist church in Dusty Creek, a quiet ceremony with 30 people in attendance, including Walter Briggs from the general store, who had the satisfaction of having written Elsie Callahan's name in the race ledger, and who attended with an expression of private vindication. Mr. Haskell from the boarding house came with his good hat on. Several of the women who had watched Elsie ride Rosie across the finish line came with flowers from their own gardens, dried and pressed and tied with ribbon against the season. Forrest Kimball from the race committee attended and shook Clement's hand with the particular firmness of a man who respected what he had observed. Marcus Dunn was not there. Harold Prout was not there either, which suited everyone including Clement perfectly well. The Reverend Aldous Marsh performed the ceremony with a seriousness that the occasion warranted, and when he asked Elsie if she took Clement Yates as her husband, she said yes, with the same direct, uncomplicated voice she used for everything she meant. When he asked Clement if he took Elsie Callahan as his wife, Clement said yes, and looked at her while he said it, and she looked back at him, and the Reverend said something else that neither of them quite heard, because they were occupied with the private and important business of understanding that this was real. The spring of 1883 was a good one on the Callahan farm, the kind of spring that Texas sometimes offers as an apology for the difficulty of its winters. The creek ran clear and full, the pastures came back in deep grass, and the kitchen garden produced with an abundance that kept Elsie busy preserving and the farmhouse smelling of good things. Clement bought a young sorrel stallion through a contact in Abilene and brought him to the farm in April. Rosie, introduced with care and patience, took to him after some initial negotiations. Clement's plan for the horse operation was sound, and Elsie's records were precise, and by the end of their first full year together the farm was not merely surviving but beginning, in small but genuine ways, to prosper. They discovered, in the particular intimacy of shared daily life, that they were well suited. They argued sometimes, as two opinionated and intelligent people will, and they argued as equals, directly and without cruelty, and they resolved their arguments with the same direct practicality they brought to everything else. They made each other laugh, which was perhaps as important as any other quality. Clement had a dry humor that came out of unexpected angles, and Elsie had a sharpness to her wit that kept him genuinely interested in what she was going to say next. In the early fall of that year, Elsie told him she was expecting. He was checking the new fence on the south pasture when she walked out to find him, and he knew something was different about the way she was walking toward him, something purposeful even beyond her usual purposefulness. He set down the fencing tool and looked at her. She stopped a few feet away from him and said, "I am going to have a baby." He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her face, and at the flat, sunlit expanse of the south pasture behind her, and at the farmhouse visible in the distance against the blue sky, and he felt something very large moving through him that was partly joy and partly a kind of reverence for the particular accumulation of things that had brought him to this exact moment in this exact field. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling fine," she said. "I am feeling very fine." He closed the distance between them and held her face in his hands and looked at her with all of that large feeling visible in his expression, not hiding it, just letting it be there. "Elsie," he said. "I know," she said. A baby. In the spring, I think, March perhaps. He kissed her forehead, her cheekbone, the corner of her mouth. She put her hands over his. We need to fix the back bedroom, she said, because she was Elsie Callahan and she was already thinking about the practical requirements of the situation. We will fix the back bedroom, he said, and we need to discuss whether to hire another hand for the spring work when I will be less useful for a period. We can discuss that, he said. Later. Later, she agreed, and leaned against him in the middle of the south pasture, with the late September light coming warm across the grass and the creek running its quiet way in the east. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was spent in a particular kind of waiting. Clement fixed the back bedroom, replacing the plank floor and adding a small window, and Elsie sewed with the practical patience of a woman who had spent enough of her life making do. They hired a young man from the neighboring farm, a 16-year-old named Sam Webb whose family had fallen on hard times, and he turned out to be willing and quick to learn, and they fed him well and taught him everything they knew, and paid him a fair wage, which he received with the transparent gratitude of someone to whom fair wages were not entirely familiar. Dusty Creek had its opinions about various things that year. The cattle drives from the southern plains were tapering off as the railroads pushed south and west, and the economy of the region was shifting in ways that the old guard found uncomfortable. There were arguments in the saloon and at the general store about land and water rights and the encroachment of big commercial operations that were buying up smaller properties with the same interested patience as Harold Prout, only on a larger and more systematic scale. Clement went to several of the public meetings held in the church hall and spoke once, carefully and precisely, about the rights of small landowners and the particular importance of water access, and people listened to him with the attention given to someone who has demonstrated that they know what they are talking about. Elsie came to those meetings too and spoke twice, and was listened to with the additional attention given to someone who had demonstrated, publicly and memorably, that they were not going to be moved. Harold Prout made no more approaches to the Callahan farm. He had made one attempt in the spring of 1883 to contest the manner of the loan payoff on a procedural technicality that his own bank documents did not actually support, and the county judge, who had a son who had watched the harvest race from the rail fence, reviewed the documents and found no merit in the complaint. Prout had accepted this with his calibrated smile and had not tried again. He directed his energies elsewhere, toward properties whose owners were less determined and less publicly celebrated. This was a reality of the time and place that Elsie and Clement could not fully remedy, but they could speak about it, and they did, when the occasions arose, with enough precision and enough standing in the community to make some difference. There were people who kept their farms because of conversations that could be traced back to Clement's steady voice in the church hall and Elsie's sharper, equally steady one beside him, and if those people never knew exactly what had helped them, the help was real regardless. On a cold, clear March morning in 1884, with a west wind coming straight off the caprock, and the last of the winter ice on the water trough, and the mockingbirds already back in the live oak by the front gate, Elsie gave birth to a son. The midwife, a broad-hipped, capable woman named Ruth Garner, who had delivered approximately 300 children in the county, and had opinions about everything and was right about most of them, pronounced both mother and child healthy with the brisk satisfaction of someone who had performed a difficult task competently. Clement sat in the straight-back chair beside the bed and held Elsie's hand while she slept the deep sleep of exhausted accomplishment, and he looked at the small bundle in the cradle beside the bed that was his son, a red-faced, emphatic creature with dark hair, and the beginnings of the particular look of a person who was going to have opinions. He thought about his father's ranch in New Mexico. He thought about the years since then, the moving and the working and the not staying. He thought about a training track in the early morning mist, and a red roan mare pulling left, and a woman on her back with copper hair who had not asked for his help, but had accepted it. He thought about the specific weight of $35 placed on 15-to-1 odds, which had turned into $525, and how that number had seemed in the moment like the largest bet he had ever made, and which he understood now had not been the largest bet at all. The largest bet had been staying. When Elsie woke, she looked first at the cradle and then at Clement, both of which checks were characteristic. "What do you want to name him?" she asked. They had discussed several names in the preceding months without arriving at a decision, which was also characteristic of two people who did not settle for the easy answer when the right one had not yet presented itself. "Thomas," he said. She looked at him. She had not expected that. "Thomas Clement Yates," he said, "if that sits right with you." She reached up and put her hand against his face, and he covered it with his, and she said yes with her eyes before she said it with her words. Thomas Clement Yates came into the world on the Callahan farm in March of 1884, and he was a demanding and cheerful baby who grew into a demanding and cheerful child, who had his father's long legs and his mother's green eyes, and a particular stubbornness in both of them that showed up in him doubled, which entertained his parents enormously and exhausted them in equal measure. Young Sam Webb, who had become so essential to the running of the farm that Clement had offered him a formal partnership arrangement in the horse operation, took a deep and solemn interest in the baby that was touching from a 16-year-old who attempted to maintain the dignified detachment appropriate to a young man of the West. He lost the battle regularly and was often found with Thomas on his knee making faces, which Thomas found hilarious. Rosie had her first foal in April of 1884, a compact bay colt with the roan mare's long stride and the sorrel stallion's power, and he was named Harvest because Clement had a sense of occasion when he allowed it, and because Elsie said the name was appropriate in ways that did not need explaining. Harvest turned out to be a very good horse. By the time Thomas was 2 years old and running the farmyard on legs that could not entirely keep up with his ambitions, the Callahan farm had grown into something that both Elsie and Clement recognized as genuine prosperity. Not wealth in the grand sense, not the kind of prosperity that bought mansions and contempt, but the solid, rooted kind that comes from land worked well, and animals cared for, and two people who had built something together with their hands and their attention. The horse operation was bringing in consistent money, with Harvest proving himself on the local race circuit and 2 additional foals showing promise. The cattle Elsie had carefully rebuilt from a modest base were producing well. The kitchen garden had expanded to the point where she was selling preserved goods in Dusty Creek, which had become a minor additional income and a significant source of local prestige. In the autumn of 1885, Elsie told Clement she was expecting again. This time he was not in the south pasture. He was in the kitchen, examining the ledger with the reading glasses he had acquired that spring and that he wore with the slight self-consciousness of a man adjusting to a new necessity. She stood in the kitchen doorway and said it plainly, as she said everything. He looked at her over the glasses. He set the ledger down. He looked at her for a moment with everything visible in his face. "March again?" he asked. "February, I think." "February," he said. He stood up from the table and came to her and kissed her forehead and held her against him. "We are going to need to talk to Ruth Garner." "Already done," she said into his shoulder. "Of course it is," he said. She laughed, and the laugh was warm and intimate and carried 12 years of marriage, which was actually 3, but felt like 12 in the best sense, the sense that meant it was fully and properly lived in. Their daughter was born in February of 1886, in a February that was milder than usual, with the first early wildflowers already pushing up through the south pasture. She was smaller than Thomas had been and considerably more determined about making herself known immediately, and she had Clement's dark hair and Elsie's green eyes, and a temperament that Ruth Garner described as very direct, which was her way of saying the child came into the world with opinions and intended to keep them. They named her Clara. Thomas, who was nearly 2 and had been preparing for this event with the ambivalence of a small person who has been the center of things and is uncertain how he feels about sharing that position, looked at Clara for approximately 30 seconds, and then attempted to give her his wooden horse, which was the thing he loved most in the world, which was his way of saying that he had decided she was acceptable. He then immediately took it back because he had not fully thought through the implications of the gesture, and Clara responded to this by screaming, and they had been in negotiation with each other about the fundamental terms of their relationship ever since, which was a negotiation that both of them clearly enjoyed. Dusty Creek in the late 1880s was a place in the middle of its own kind of becoming. The railroads were changing the patterns of commerce and people, and the open cattle drives that had defined the earlier era were giving way to fenced ranges and more settled patterns of ranching. The law was more present than it had been in the early part of the decade, and the particular wildness that had characterized the frontier was being replaced, not without some loss, by something more organized and more permanent. Clement watched these changes with the attention of someone who had lived through the transition from one kind of world to another before. He thought the changes were mostly good. The law being more present was mostly good. The farming and ranching being more settled was mostly good. Some things that had been allowed by the absence of order, the taking of lands from people who had fewer lawyers and fewer connections, the informal violences that went unaddressed, were being named and sometimes addressed, though not with the completeness that justice required. He talked about these things with Elsie on the porch in the evenings, and she listened and added her own observations, which were often sharper and more specific than his, because she had seen more of the particular ways those things operated in the lives of women and people without means. They were conversations that did not resolve everything, because everything could not be resolved from one porch in one county in Texas, but they were conversations worth having. Harold Prout left Dusty Creek in 1887, not under dramatic circumstances, simply moving his operations to a larger city with a larger bank where the returns were better. The building that had housed his bank was taken over by a younger banker named Cooper who had the reputation, largely borne out in practice, of dealing more straightforwardly with his clients. People were cautiously relieved. Caution was appropriate. Relief was also appropriate. Walter Briggs at the general store expanded his stock as the railroad made a wider range of goods available, and Dusty Creek grew from a town of 300 to a town of 500, and then 800 over the course of the decade, with new buildings going up on the main street and a proper school established in 1888 that Elsie had been instrumental in pushing the county to fund. She had sat in 3 county meetings on the subject of the school, speaking with the particular authority of someone who had been given a good education by a father who believed it mattered, and she had brought Clement, who had spoken once with the brevity and precision that made him effective in public settings, and together they had pushed the argument far enough that the county finally acted. Thomas started school in 1889. He was 5 years old and had been learning to read from Elsie for a year already, which meant that he arrived at the new schoolhouse ahead of most of the other children and spent some time being difficult about it until his teacher, a patient young woman named Miss Haverson, found ways to challenge him that did not involve making the other children feel left behind. Clara was 3 and had strong opinions about not being old enough for school yet. Clement turned 40 in the spring of 1890 on the Callahan farm that was also, by then, simply called the Yates farm by most people in the county, though the deeds still read Callahan farm, and Elsie was in no hurry to change that. It was the Callahan farm. It was also home. Both things were true and both things were kept. 40 felt different than he had expected. He had spent so many years moving that he had imagined a kind of restlessness would be permanent, a chronic inability to stay that would reassert itself regardless of circumstances. It had not happened. He was in the kitchen at his own farm at his own table with his wife across from him, reading from the newspaper, and his son in the yard feeding the chickens, with the particular cheerful aggression that a 6-year-old brings to farm tasks, and his daughter asleep in the back bedroom with the new window that let in the morning light, and the smell of coffee and the sound of the creek in the east pasture and Rosie in the barn. 20 years old and retired from everything except being the gentle, patient foundation of a horse operation she had earned with 3 miles of determined running. He did not feel restless. He felt, in the most complete and settled sense of the word, home. Elsie looked up from the newspaper. "You are looking at things again," she said. "I do that," he said. "What are you looking at?" He looked at her across the kitchen table, with the morning light from the window across her copper hair that had some silver in it now, which she wore without any particular concern, and her dark green eyes that were as direct and as particular as they had been on that first morning at the training track. "I am looking at how it turned out," he said. She set down the newspaper. "And how did it turn out?" He thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved, the way he thought about things he intended to mean. "Better than I had any right to expect," he said. "Better than I knew enough to hope for." She looked at him for a moment. Then she put her hand across the table and he put his over it. "I entered a horse race," she said, "because I did not know what else to do. I watched a horse race," he said, "for the same reason." She smiled at that, the full, real smile that he had never in 8 years gotten tired of. "And then," she said. "And then I stayed," he said. Thomas came in from the yard with chicken feed still on his boots, and the cheerful obliviousness of a 6-year-old who does not realize he is interrupting anything. And Clement lifted him up onto his knee, and Elsie poured the coffee, and outside on the Llano Estacado the October morning was clear and dry, and the red land went out in every direction under the big sky, and the creek ran in the east pasture, and on the south pasture Harvest, now 6 years old and the best horse in 3 counties, was running in a slow circle because he liked to, because the morning was good and the grass was good, and there was no reason not to run. Sam Webb, 23 now and a proper partner in the horse operation, and an essential part of the farm's daily life, was fixing the fence line on the north pasture with the focused competence of someone who had learned everything he knew in this place from these people, and had become someone real because of it. He had a girl in town, a quiet, sensible young woman named Abigail who came to Sunday dinners and helped Elsie in the kitchen, and who Sam looked at with an expression Clement recognized from personal experience. He had mentioned this to Elsie one evening on the porch. "I know," Elsie had said. "I have been watching it for 4 months. Are you going to say anything to him?" "I thought I might invite Abigail to spend a week helping with the spring canning," she said. "Give them more time in proximity." He looked at her. "That is either very kind or very strategic." "In my experience," she said, which was exactly what he had said to her years ago on the training track about philosophy and horse training, "they are the same thing." He had laughed and she had laughed, and the porch and the evening and the whole arrangement of things felt like something that had been built correctly from good materials by people who had paid attention. Abigail came to help with the spring canning. Sam proposed in the summer. They married in September of 1890 in the same Methodist church where Clement and Elsie had married 7 years before, and Clement stood as Sam's witness, and Elsie stood as Abigail's. And Thomas was the ring bearer and lost the ring for approximately 4 minutes before finding it in his jacket pocket. And Clara was 3 and wore a white dress, and was completely certain she was the most important person in the proceeding, and conducted herself accordingly. The decade turned and the land stayed and the horses ran and the children grew. Thomas at 7 was a serious student and a wild outdoorsman, which was a combination his parents found entirely comprehensible. He was learning to ride with the natural facility of a child who had grown up around horses, and by 9 he was exercising the young horses under Clement's supervision, with a gentle hand that showed he had inherited something essential from both of them. Clara at 6 was the farm's most vocal critic and most devoted admirer, an ongoing combination. She told Clement when the fence work was done wrong, and she told Elsie when the bread was particularly good, and both opinions were expressed with exactly equal conviction. She could also ride, having decided at 4 that she intended to, and having learned with the same direct purpose she brought to everything. She had opinions about Rosie, who was ancient and gentle and who Clara visited every morning as a matter of personal priority. Elsie watched her daughter on the old mare's back one morning, small and straight, talking to Rosie in a low, serious voice, and felt something move through her that was not describable in simple terms. It was the future in its early stages. It was the past paying forward. In the spring of 1892, when Thomas was 8 and Clara was 6, the Yates family drove into Dusty Creek for the harvest race, which still ran every October, in their good wagon with harvest tied behind it. Clement had entered harvest with Sam riding, because Sam was lighter and a good horseman and Clement was 42, and had made his peace with watching. The race was everything it had been in 1882 and more, with a larger crowd and a larger prize and horses from 3 counties. The betting board showed harvest at 2-1, which Clement thought was slightly optimistic, but not wrong. Thomas pressed against the fence rail beside his father and watched the riders assemble at the start with wide eyes. "Which one is harvest?" he asked, though he knew perfectly well. "The chestnut," Clement said. "He is the fastest," Thomas said. "He might be," Clement said. "We will see." Elsie was on the other side of Clement with Clara on her hip, and she looked at the track and at the horses and at her husband's face in profile. And she thought about a morning 8 years ago when she had stood at a fence at the far end of this track with a woman she had been then who was younger and more frightened and more alone. And she thought about how that morning had happened and about all the mornings since. The starting pistol fired. Harvest went out clean and settled into his stride in the first quarter mile, which was exactly what Sam had been instructed to do. Clement watched with his arms on the fence rail, and Thomas beside him and Clara on Elsie's hip shouting something enthusiastic and not entirely coherent. And the morning was clear and October sharp, and the horses ran the red earth in a streaming line, and the crowd made its noise. Harvest won by 3 lengths, which was decisive in a way that left no discussion necessary. Thomas climbed 3 rails up the fence and screamed with a pure joy that was so uncomplicated and so complete that several adults near him started smiling despite themselves. Clement looked at Elsie. She was already looking at him with that expression he knew completely, the one that was not quite a smile and was not the absence of one, the one that meant she was taking something seriously. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him and Clara between them, grabbed both of their collars and demanded to know if Harvest had won, which Clara already knew but needed confirmed. "Yes," Elsie said. "He won." "I knew it," Clara said with the absolute conviction of a 6-year-old. "Did you?" Clement said. "He always wins," Clara said. "He is our horse." He looked over his daughter's head at his wife's face, and she looked back at him, and the understanding between them was as complete and as quiet and as deep as the creek in the east pasture. He had bet everything on a woman and a roan mare running a race on a red dirt track in 1882, and he had been right in every way that mattered. Some bets, he thought, you make not because you are certain, but because you have watched carefully enough to know what is real when you see it. And some things once found you stay for. He had stayed. The farm was alive around them. The horses ran in the south pasture. The creek ran in the east. Rosie stood in her paddock in the long afternoon light, 22 years old and easy, watching the activity with patient dark eyes. Thomas was at the fence talking to Sam about the race with the rapid, precise questions of a child who had inherited his mother's need to understand, and his father's need to understand it correctly. Clara had climbed down from Elsie's hip and was running toward the horses with the absolute confidence of a small person who belongs. The Llano Estacado spread out around Dusty Creek in every direction, that vast flat plain of red earth and sky that was not beautiful to everyone, but was beautiful to those who had learned to read it, whose particular beauty was the beauty of honest things, of things exactly as they are with nothing added or hidden. Elsie took Clement's hand. He held it. The afternoon light came down long and level and golden across everything, the same light that had been coming down on this land for 1,000 years and would come down for 1,000 more. And in it, the Yates family stood at the fence of the Dusty Creek Fairgrounds on the day their horse won the harvest race, and they were where they were supposed to be, which is the only thing a person can hope for and the best thing a life can produce. The roan mare Rosie lived to be 25 years old and died on a warm spring morning in 1895 with her nose in the crook of Elsie's elbow, and Elsie sat with her for the last of it and talked to her the way she had talked to her on the night before the race and the way she had talked to her on 1,000 mornings before that. And when it was done, she let herself cry, which she rarely did, and Clement found her in the paddock and sat with her in the spring grass and did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said. They buried Rosie at the east edge of the south pasture where the creek could be heard from. Thomas put a flat stone at the head of it and carved the name himself with careful, imprecise letters that were full of intention. Clara put wildflowers. Harvest, turned out to the south pasture that afternoon, went and stood near the stone for a long time before moving away, which was something none of them expected and all of them remembered. The farm continued and the seasons went and the children grew into people, and the Yates name settled into the county the way a building settles into its foundation, with the particular permanence of something that belongs where it is. Thomas was 18 in 1902 and already indispensable to the horse operation, with a particular gift for training that Sam recognized as matching and in some specific ways exceeding his father's, which Clement received with the exact combination of pride and dry humor the situation deserved. Thomas was also in love with a girl from the next county, a dark-haired young woman named Frances, who was strong-minded and kind in equal measure, and who Elsie approved of with the thoroughness she applied to approving of things. Clara was 16 in 1902 and had determined to become a teacher, which Elsie's father would have been enormously proud of, and which Elsie herself supported with everything she had. Clara had the same appetite for precision and the same direct intelligence as her mother, applied to language and numbers, and the particular satisfaction of watching someone understand something they had not understood before. The world was changing around them in ways that 1882 could not have predicted. The telephone had come to Dusty Creek in 1899, and Walter Briggs had one in the general store that everyone gathered around with the mixed fascination and suspicion that new things received. The railroad ran through now with regularity. The great cattle drives were a memory, the subject of stories told by older men in the saloon and in the church. But the farm was the farm. The land was the land. The creek ran in the east pasture. On a fall evening in 1902, 20 years after a red roan mare had crossed a finish line 2 lengths ahead of a gray quarter horse in the Dusty Creek harvest race, Clement and Elsie sat on the porch of the Callahan farm in the last of the October light. Thomas was in the barn. Clara was inside reading. Sam and Abigail's house, which they had built on the north section 15 years ago, showed a light against the darkening sky. A coyote called from the south pasture and another answered from the caprock. 20 years, Elsie said. This October, Clement said. Yes. She was 47 and he was 52, and she had silver in her copper hair and he had gray in his dark hair, and neither of them was the person they had been on that training track in the early morning mist, and both of them were entirely themselves. Was it what you expected, she asked, when you decided to stay? He considered it with the seriousness she deserved, as he always had. I did not know what to expect, he said. I only knew what I was betting on. And I was right, he said. She looked at him sideways with that expression, the one that was not quite a smile and was not the absence of one, the one he had been looking at for 20 years and had never gotten anywhere near tired of. Yes, she said, you were. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and the October night came down over the Llano Estacado, cool and clear and full of stars, the same stars that had always been there, the same sky, the same red land going out in every direction to the edge of what could be seen. The creek ran in the east pasture. The horses breathed in the barn. The children were inside or nearby or building their own lives in the full-grown morning of themselves. Clement Yates had come to Dusty Creek, Texas in October of 1882 with a lame horse and no particular intention of staying, and he had watched a widow ride a red roan mare around a training track in the early mist, and he had walked to a fence and said something about a left-pulling rein, and he had never in his life made a faster or more certain bet than the one he had made in the following 16 days and every day after. On Elsie Callahan and the farm and the particular future that two determined people could build on honest ground. It had been the right bet. It always had been. The porch held them in the evening quiet, and the stars came out above the Llano Estacado one by one and then all at once, as they always did, as they always would, and the farm was still, and the night was good.